Okay, so today user Ice Apollo asked me to help him figure out this drawing, how to make it much more active and interesting because it's a little bit static right now. And my suggestion is look at reference. There are plenty of sites out there and Pinterest and DeviantArt accounts and profiles that specifically that are specifically tailored for artists in that they have photographic reference for you. Um, that using that reference will help you make your drawings much more dynamic. So let's say, for example, I want this pose right there. Uh, Program's not working right now. There we go. Um, the pencil started working. So, for example, I would use a combination of gesture drawing and sight size drawing to get that pose as quickly as possible. Something like that. Right there. Doesn't have to be exact. That's not the point. You're not copying. The point is to get an understanding of the pose so that it feels like the pose. There's no time limit. There's nobody saying that you have to get it in 30 seconds or a minute or anything like that. Um, it's just a matter of capturing the feeling. For me, that feels a little bit short, actually. So I'm going to erase in order to better my proportions because, sure, if I was only interested in the gesture, I could do that. But I think part of improving it as an artist is seeing and correcting your mistakes as soon as you do. So for me, I saw that the proportions were off. I could leave it, draw it again on the side, but I have an eraser. I can correct it right away. There's no reason for me to wait. And then I can go back and start adding things like anatomy. And that's what I have. It's a fairly quick process. I don't have to spend a whole lot of time doing it, and it allows me to get a better understanding of how the body works at the same time. So um, it's actually a pretty good exercise, a good way to get warmed up in the morning. Just do a few of these, and your body and your mind will already be thinking how to uh, how to keep the poses much more dynamic. When I'm drawing, it's hard for me to talk at the same time, so forgive me if I say something that doesn't make sense. Feel free to go ahead and ask for clarifications in the comment area, in the comments area. You also see me doing is that I'm not just I can copy the pose exactly, but as you saw with this back leg, I pushed it a little further back. Same thing with this arm. I don't have to stop right there. I can push it a little bit higher and push this head down just a little bit more. That just helps make it much more dynamic. I'm not happy with how the head is sitting right there. And I'm having a hard time understanding this arm right there. Sure, I can just draw it in, but that defeats the purpose of studying from reference. You really want to try to understand what is going on there. If you're just going to copy, it stops being a gesture study. It's and starts being uh, more of a copying assignment. And that's good when you want to learn proportions and train your eyes to uh, train your hand-eye coordination. But when you are drawing something from the imagination, when you're a comic book artist or an animator, you really want to understand what is going on. Not happy with this. It feels a little bit too stiff to me. So I'm gonna get that out just a little bit more. Something like that. That feels a lot more dynamic to me. I can even exaggerate that just a little bit more. Um, Maybe push that right there. Now it feels like an attack. This arm, I could push down there, and now it feels even more like an attack. Although these proportions are a little bit off. So I just erase and go back and fix them. That's simple. What else can I do? Let's try this one. Notice how I'm handling it. I'm handling it from the greatest single line I can draw. So I can draw it like that. That's my head. That's my body. Not my body, but her body, or the body of the drawing. Uh, my curves aren't nearly as nice. Um, but when I start doing that, it feels like I'm copying. So I'm just gonna exaggerate a little bit more and emphasize a little bit more um, exaggeration and analysis. And that's how simple it is to draw an arm. It's just the gesture. The gesture isn't about getting every single bump of the anatomy. It's about getting the vectors or the direction that the anatomy is going. And once you get that, you can start going back in and adding the construction and anatomy. That's just going to make your life so much easier when you break it down into a process. So that's one example of the same pose. I can push it even more. To make it even more dynamic. And that's what pushing is. It's exaggerating. Um, it's it's good practice to see how far you can push something before it stops working. How do you know when it stops working? You got to think about things like balance, for example. Um, Here's the pit of her neck. That means if I draw a straight line down, that's her. That's where the balance is somewhere in between these two legs. Um, that point would be her shoulder, actually. That so if I were to draw a line straight down her shoulder, her knee would be right underneath it. Um, it's a tricky thing to achieve. Let me try and explain it this way. So if I were to, uh, where's the rotate tool? Ah, okay. So if this body was like that, it would look like she's either uphill or falling down. So let me erase that and say the ground was like that. It's obvious she's gonna tip over. Um, Same thing on this one right here. The key is keeping the center of balance. It's a point that, I honestly don't know how to explain it. It's something that's so visual to me that I can tell just by looking at it, but to try to put it into words, I honestly have no idea how to explain it. So I'm not even going to bullshit you. It's just something visual to me, and I'm guessing it's going to have to become something visual to you because even if you could put it into words, you need to train your eye to see it. So, and I think you can already. When you're walking around and you see somebody about to trip and fall, you know they're going to trip and fall before they actually fall. And you know when somebody's going to catch their footing again, when they're going to find their footing again, when they're going to catch their balance again. Um, that's how visual and instinctual it is to us. So you need to train that. And one way to do that is to separate yourself from your own drawing as soon as possible and to flip it. By flipping it, it stops looking like your own drawing. Like these drawings don't look like something I drew. They look like something somebody else did. And it's that much easier for me to see my mistakes as a result. That's a good thing. You want to be able to see your mistakes as soon as possible so that you can fix your mistakes faster. The faster you fix your mistakes, the sooner you can move on to a new drawing or finish this drawing. Let me put it like this. Would you rather catch your mistakes after you finish the drawing, after you've finished coloring it, after you've finished doing all the line work and construction, and after you've fallen in love with it, or when you've just barely put in any effort? I would personally find all the mistakes as soon as possible before I've had a chance to fall in love with it so that I don't feel exhausted when it comes time to correct it. Oh, this one would require much more erasing than uh, just simply redrawing it. So one thing I can do is just go redraw it. So I'm taking what's already there and exaggerating it. There's no rule saying that just because you use reference, it has to be an exact copy. One thing I like about the gesture approach is that it allows me to find shapes that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise as I'm drawing and constructing. So, for example, I really, really like this shape right here. For me, that leg shape is more like foot is turned outwards. And when I do that, when I draw, I actually do talk to myself sometimes when I'm looking at reference. And I tell myself things like foot is turned outwards so that I know that the foot will not be pointing this way, it will be pointing that way. And as soon as I say that to myself, um, I actually make sure to keep that in my drawing. So, but in this case, his leg is turned like that. I changed it because, as I said, there's no rule saying that you have to copy the gesture exactly. So if I were to finish this and in order to maintain that shape, this is how I might do it. And that would give me an interesting shape as well as an interesting pose. So going back to your drawing specifically, here is how I might do it. So I asked myself, what's the basic action? She's just standing there. that's not interesting to me. What do I want her to do? Maybe she's just standing there and showing off, like one of those tough guy movie posters. So maybe she's just like holding that helmet right there. Um, One thing I can do is go contrapposto. Contrapposto is a type of pose where instead of having the weight balanced equally on both legs, she would be putting the figure would be putting the weight on just one leg, something like that. I can even put it out like that. And here's the pit of the collar of the neck, the pit of the neck, and that goes down and touches that ankle. You know things like that from experience by studying lots of life drawings, by doing a lot of life drawings and studying a lot of photos. So that's something I would also recommend, doing gestures from life, doing gestures from photos. Um, that will help you get a better understanding of the human figure. This would need to come down so that she has a grip. And notice how technically bad these drawings are. Um, they're not anatomically correct. They're not solid drawings. Like this doesn't have to look like the best hand ever. It just has to indicate to me that it is a hand and how it wraps around the helmet. Um, I'm not sure what's going on here. I'm guessing she's either making a fist or she's grabbing the strap. For the sake of interest and not so typical tough guy posing, let's have her grab the strap. What I'm doing there is creating a 3D version. I'm exuding or extruding the shape so that I can make it more 3D. And that will just make my life a lot easier when it comes time to constructing it. Let's see, maybe the shoulders a bit more like that because she's raising that arm. And the shoulders act independently, so you can raise both shoulders as in a shrug. So let's see, her hands like that. Her shoulder would be like that, maybe. Yeah, that could work. And then she's got the strap going through there and then wrapping around her body. That would definitely make the pose a lot more dramatic. The rest is just knowing proportions and, in general, memorizing them. There's no excuse. There's no way to get out of it. You're going to have to do some memorization. Um, just like with everything, just like you memorize spelling of words and the order of the alphabet and the numbers, you're going to have to memorize. You're going to have to memorize the proportions. You're going to have to memorize the locations of the uh, you're going to have to memorize some anatomy, some general anatomy, so that you know the landmarks and what to hit and how it needs to look in order to be correct. And it doesn't need to be clean, it needs to be clear. Um, so my line work, for example, is very messy, but the shapes that they're defining, that's very, very clear. You can tell what I'm trying to communicate very clearly. What I like about this figure, and it's important to note what you like, otherwise you're going to ignore it, and you don't want to ignore the stuff you like. What I like about the design of this figure is that she's a little chubby. She's not your typical stick thin model like figure. I like the meat on her. So that's what I would try to capture in my final drawing. And now that I've got the placement of the hand, I can go back in and start worrying about things like the anatomy of it. That works for me. Um, let's see, I don't need that line. I need this shoulder to be a little bit bigger. Let's flip it. How's that looking? This arm would need to be like that. Something like that. Yeah, I think this is working pretty good. I could exaggerate that muscle right there. Give her just a little bit more. Meat right there. Turn this a little bit more so that I know this is the perspective that I'm seeing it at. Round this out a little bit more to give the feeling of some fat over there rather than make it bony. What else? Let's start breaking that face down into constructive parts. Something like that. Let's see here. Construct everything. So even if you're drawing like a biker helmet, you want to get reference and understand how that's built so that you can draw a convincing version of it. Maybe something like that. There we go. So that's how I would make the pose much more dynamic. Same basic idea, but I'm just shifting the balance. And that's a pretty good way to think of playing with dynamism versus something that's static. Something that's dynamic is usually off balance, and something that or has shifted balance or uneven balance. Um, Something that's static has pretty centered balance. So think of a building versus a tree. Which one is much more dynamic? If you just draw a building like that versus a tree that's like that. It's just got a different center of balance. The silhouettes are much more interesting than a simple rectangle. So you want to think in terms like that, visual abstraction. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Hope it helps.